Hey, thanks very much, Ambassador Tuttle, for that introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, you'd expect me to say it, but it really is an honor to be here. And frankly, it would be humbling enough to look out at the audience and see who's here, but to be here in the halls with all the reminders of the great communicator and be expected to make a speech is truly humbling, and I mean that sincerely. I've been asked to speak for about 10 minutes before taking questions, and I thought what I'd do is share a few thoughts about the strategic landscape and, probably as importantly, the implications for the joint force. But before I do that, I'd like to make a few comments about the state of the force today. You know, for the last few years, we've had an ongoing dialogue about the adverse impact of uncertainty and 15 years at war. And all of the service chiefs, and most of them are here today, have testified to the very real challenges of worn-out equipment, deferred modernization, high operational tempo, and unstable budgets. And many of the elected officials who are here today have been equally vocal about negative trends in our readiness. And our nation is unique, actually, I think, in having a very public and candid dialogue about our capability gaps and shortfalls. And I don't think we'd have it any other way. It's the nature of democracy, and we're all focused, at the end of the day, I think it's fair to say we're all focused on making sure that our men and women in uniform are never in a fair fight. But without understating the challenges of our readiness and the erosion of our competitive advantage, which is very real and has occurred over the last few years, I want you to know a few things. First, I have absolute confidence that the joint force today can defend the homeland in our way of life. I have absolute confidence that the joint force today can meet our alliance commitments. And I have absolute confidence that the joint force today has a competitive advantage over any potential adversary. And I think it's important that in our public dialogue about readiness that we have that in context. I think it needs to be understood. It needs to be understood by our allies that that's the case. It needs to be understood by our adversaries. And I also think it's important that the American public understands that they have the most competent, the most professional, and the most capable military force in the world today. And I'm able to say all that, I think, for three fundamental reasons. First, because the Congress has ensured that our men and women in uniform have been properly supported over the last 15 years. We've never sent, and I think this is not hyperbole, we've never sent a better trained and equipped force to war than the one we sent over the past 15 years. And for that, we can thank the members of the House Armed Service Committee, Senate Armed Service Committee, and the Appropriations Committee. And I know in particular Chairman Thornberry, who's a co-host today, is here today. We can certainly thank him. Second, I'm confident about our competitive advantage because of our partners in industry, many of whom are in the audience right now. I think only, and it's fair to say, only America has such a deep bench of creative and talented professionals who deliver world-class warfighting solutions to our force. But most of all, I'm confident about our ability to defend the nation because of the extraordinary quality of the young men and women that we are fortunate enough to recruit and to retain. Over the last 15 months, I've had the privilege of visiting many of them, and needless to say, it's been the best part of my job. I've met sailors like Petty Officer 3rd Class Edelson Lazo. He's aboard the USS Barry in Yokosuka. He and his fellow sailors have been underway 70% of the time over the past 12 months. And for those in the Navy, you know what you do when you're in between deployments. That 70% of the time at sea means a lot of work getting the ship ready to go and training before you go. And they're there to assure our allies in the Pacific and also to be prepared to respond to the North Korean missile threat. I've met Marines like Corporal Adam Senor. He's an artilleryman who was providing support for the Iraqis as they were preparing to attack Mosul. And you know, after he was wounded, his primary concern, and this won't surprise you, his primary concern was leaving his buddies behind, and he didn't, he stayed. I've met airmen like Staff Sergeant Derek Tarini, who is advising and coaching Afghans as they build an air force. And I've met soldiers like Sergeant Major Matt Barrick. He's a Green Beret with 7th Special Forces Group who trains Colombians to counter illicit trafficking. In his 19 years of service, Matt has deployed 16 times to 20 different countries. And that reflects in the quality and the competence of the non-commissioned officers that we have in uniform today. And I've met many others who are performing a range of missions, from supporting the nuclear mission from a silo in North Dakota, to conducting cyber operations at Fort Meade, Maryland, to conducting counterterrorism operations in East Africa against al-Qaeda. If I can, with the Commandant's permission, use a Marine Corps expression, your soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen are literally today in every clime and place. The range of missions that are conducted by the U.S. military not only reflects the quality of the force, but it highlights the complexity of today's security and challenges and the essential role of the United States in meeting those challenges. And it's not just my visit with the troops that have convinced me of that. As I've traveled around the world and I've met with senior political and military leaders, one thing is abundantly clear to me. The United States is widely considered to be an indispensable nation and the guarantor of the international order that's brought relative peace to our nation, to our allies, and extraordinary economic prosperity since World War II. Even nations who publicly criticize us in private talk about the importance of our leadership and the role that we play. And while our global leadership and influence is the product of much more than our military capabilities, and I recognize that, the competitive advantage that we have enjoyed over potential adversaries has been a critical component of our national power and the role that we play on the world stage. And the primary enablers of our competitive advantage, in my judgment, are the network of alliances and partnerships that we have developed over the past 70 years in our ability to project power when and where needed to advance our national interests. But as I've said many times to the troops when I visit them, I said, you know what? We're not going to get any credit tomorrow for what we did yesterday. So while I believe we can meet today's challenges, we can't take our competitive advantage for granted in a dynamic and complex security environment. So what kind of military forces will the United States need to meet its global responsibilities in the near and long-term future? What's going to be the nature of the threats we face? What capabilities will be the most relevant in dealing with those threats? And what do we need to maintain a competitive advantage in our ability to project power and sustain the force in the future? As the chiefs and the combatant commanders and I answer those questions, we have looked at our future and our current capabilities against 4 state actors, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and 1 non-state challenge, violent extremism. And that framework isn't intended to be predictive. I think I speak for all of us in saying that if our time on uniform has done anything, it's made us humble about our ability to predict the future. And I'm not suggesting that conflict with any of these state actors is inevitable, but I think looking at these 4 state challenges and one non-state challenge provides a pretty useful framework to inform our planning, our capability development, and our assessment of operational and strategic risk. As military planners, we necessarily focus on the military capabilities of potential adversaries as opposed to their intent or their political objectives. And we make an important assumption. This is an important assumption we make. We say that if we build a force that can deal with the challenges associated with those state actors or some combination of those state actors in violent extremism, we will build a force with the inherent flexibility and responsiveness to deal with most assuredly will be something we don't expect in the future. So I'm going to just quickly highlight what we see when we look at those challenges through a purely military perspective. I'll start with Russia, which presents the greatest array of military challenges. Despite very negative, and we know them, demographic and economic trends, Russia has made significant investments in its military capabilities. They're also operating with a frequency, and it was mentioned this morning, with a frequency and in places that we haven't seen for decades. Over the past several years, we've seen them modernize a number of systems that pose a direct threat to the United States and its allies. This includes long-range conventional strike and nuclear capabilities, as well as a full array of cyber, space, ground, electronic warfare, and maritime capabilities. And I think their modernization efforts have to be viewed in the context of their activities in the Ukraine and Crimea and Syria. In my judgment, their operations and their capability development, coupled with asymmetric doctrinal and strategic approaches, are designed to counter NATO and U.S. power projection capability and undermine the credibility of the NATO alliance and the United States' ability to meet its commitments to NATO. Moving to the Asia-Pacific region, while our nation, as a matter of policy, seeks opportunities to cooperate with a rising China, from a military perspective, we're closely watching their capability development and their operational activities. China's budget expenditures are fairly opaque, but by some accounts, they're spending as much as 7% of their gross domestic product on defense, and that trend has been going on for over a decade. And it's clear that China has embarked on a significant program to modernize and expand its nuclear enterprise, along with its power projection, space, cyber, ballistic missile, cruise missile, and air defense capabilities. And similar to Russia, when we look at China's capability development in their actions, we assess their focus on limiting our ability to project power in the Pacific and in undermining the credibility of the United States to meet its alliance commitments in the Pacific. In the interest of time, I'll just say a couple of words about North Korea and Iran. North Korea's behavior and capability development continues to pose a threat to our allies and potentially now the homeland. And we have seen over the last several years their pursuit of nuclear weapons, along with a concerted effort to build intercontinental ballistic missile, cyber, and space capabilities. In the case of the Iranian regime, it aims to establish itself as the dominant power in the Middle East. And I often say that their major export is malign influence. Iran supports terrorist organizations while modernizing an array of maritime, ballistic missile, space, cyber, and cruise missile capabilities. And in addition to destabilizing the Middle East, they threaten freedom of navigation along critical commercial routes. Meanwhile, non-state actors such as ISIL and al-Qaeda remain a threat to the homeland and the American people, our allies, and our partners. Some have called violent extremism a generational struggle, and I wouldn't argue with that. Of course, there's a military dimension to our response. We can disrupt attacks against the homeland, we can dismantle their capability, and we can build the capacity of indigenous forces. But we cannot address the conditions that underlie violent extremism. And that's why we continue to support a long-term intergovernmental and coalition approach to the challenge while prioritizing our military efforts against the external threat and ensuring that wherever the enemy is, we dismantle their capabilities. The challenge of violent extremism and the four-state challenge, as I mentioned, have a number of implications for the joint force. And today, again, in the interest of time, I'll just address two of them. The first implication that I'll address is what I would describe as foundational. We require a balanced inventory of military capabilities with sufficient capacity to give us a competitive advantage across the full range of military operations in the context of the challenges that I just addressed. As a nation that thinks and acts globally, I don't think we have the choice between a force that can fight the Islamic State and one that can deter and defeat a state actor with a full range of nuclear and conventional capabilities. Nor do we have the luxury of choosing between meeting our current operational requirements, addressing those very real readiness challenges I mentioned a minute ago, and developing the capabilities that we will need to meet tomorrow's challenges. Today, we not only have the current readiness challenge I mentioned, but we also have a pressing need to modernize the force to ensure we maintain a safe and credible nuclear deterrent in a competitive edge in conventional ground, maritime, air, space, and cyberspace capabilities. But I also acknowledge that maintaining a competitive advantage to meet our requirements can't be solved exclusively by increasing the size of the force or buying more platforms. We have to prioritize the development of disruptive, innovative ways to meet our requirements, and I want to assure you that we're investing intellectual capital and time along that end as well. The second implication I want to talk about is the one that indicates that we have to better integrate all elements of national power to advance our interests on a day-to-day basis. Due to our competitive advantage, I believe a conventional conflict with a state actor is less likely in the near term. But the absence of conventional conflict should not be confused with peace. We tend to have a binary perspective of security environment. We're either at peace or at war. And that perspective informs the activities and the authorities that we give to the combatant commanders in our agencies and departments in the field. But state actors like Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, they're not restricted by that model. They effectively leverage traditional military activity and force posture with economic coercion, political influence, information operations, unconventional operations, cyber capabilities, all to advance their national interests on a day-to-day basis. And they do that in a way that avoids the penalty of escalation. I think we all know Russia is particularly adept in waging what I would describe as adversarial competition that has a military dimension, but it's short of traditional armed conflict. And they do that in a way that affects the credibility of our alliances and our ability to project power. Advancing our interests in the 21st century is going to require that we fully understand the dynamic and we develop effective responses. These implications, the need for a balanced inventory of capabilities and the need to reconsider how we compete with other state actors on a day-to-day basis, have to be addressed if we're going to continue to play our traditional role as a global leader. And to do that, we need clearly established priorities for capability development and a stable and predictable budget that enables wise fiscal decisions to be made with a long-term view. And I know many of the panels today have been addressing that. And in the end, I know that that's going to be the primary focus for those of us in Washington in the coming months. And you have my commitment, and again, I think I speak for the chiefs in this regard, that we're prepared to do our part this spring, informed by the dialogue that we've had over the past year as we have developed together the classified national military strategy and the risk assessment that we will submit to the Congress after the first of the year. We also need to include the necessity to compete on a day-to-day basis in our basic strategic documents. And we've begun to do that in our national military strategy this year, but I think it's fair to say there's more to be done. In the end, if we fail to make the right investments right now, and we fail to make the adaptations necessary to be competitive, our competitive advantage is going to continue to erode, as will our ability to lead. And in the end, I don't think we'll be able to meet the enduring commitment that we all have, and I know the one we share, and the reason why we have come together here for these 2 days, the commitment that we have to the young men and women in uniform that we will never send them into a fair fight. And with that, I'm on the 0 mark in the back, and Governor Wilson, sir, I'm ready for questions.
General, you've been very clear, and I would just ask this. If I possessed a magic wand and were capable of granting you whatever wish you might express, what would you wish for that would address what you perceive to be the gravest threat? And what would you wish for to address that threat?
Governor, you said magic wand, right?
Yes.
Okay. So
that does not include influencing congressional budgeting.
No.
That's beyond magic.
Because you did say magic, though, you know, I think the one thing that I would ask for and the one thing that I would encourage is I think we need a consensus on national security. We need a consensus on what we stand for, and then we can have a conversation informed by that about what we need to do that. Unfortunately, I think many times we're involved in a discussion about how to do something before we agree on what it is we need to do. And so if we had clarity on what it is that needs to be done as a nation, we can then that would inform a discussion about how to do it. And quite frankly, if that were accompanied by a stable and predictable budget, if we just had that framework, well, we might not get it exactly right, but we'd hit the 80% mark, and we would maintain the competitive advantage that we have had for the last several decades well into the future. That'd be what I'd ask for, Governor. So if you could do that for us, it'd be very helpful.
Thank you. All right, we will now entertain questions. And if you have a question, I would ask that you stand so that I can see you. And when recognized, you might care to identify yourself and your organization if you're affiliated with one.
And Governor, if there are no further questions.
Yeah, you and I can just have a conversation if there are no questions. Yes, sir, in the back. Wait just a second till we get a microphone to you.
Thank you, General. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. Do you have any concerns about a general who was so recently retired becoming the next Secretary of Defense? As you know, General Mattis was recently nominated, or will be nominated for that position.
Do I have any concerns? No.
General, as a first lieutenant, I hesitate to offer a suggestion, but I'm going to. How about hell no? All right, who is next? Yes, sir. Wait just a minute. This young man is going to get a lot of exercise.
Ken Heps. President-elect Trump has said one of his major goals when he comes into office is to defeat ISIS and to kick the blank out of them. Is there a strategy to do so?
Sure. In fact, number one, there is today. We're going to review that, obviously. The President-elect has indicated he wants a review of that. We met with the transition team on Wednesday and began a dialogue that will be ongoing here over the next several weeks. And, you know, the one thing that we won't do as a team coming in is we're not going to be the folks in uniform that say, look, we've already thought of everything. We're comfortable with where we are. If there's anything I would tell you is we're never complacent about where we are against the threat of the Islamic State. Having said that, we think that over the past year we have made some significant progress. We've significantly limited the territory they hold. We've reduced their freedom of movement. We've disrupted their ability to plan and conduct external operations. We've gotten after their resources, and I think we've put a dent in it. Having said that, there are some things that we would probably bring into the new administration for consideration, because obviously there's a policy framework within which the military dimension of the strategy takes place today. And we'll make sure that as we go through transition, they understand what that policy framework is. They understand where there may be some flexibility to make changes in that policy framework, which will then inform maybe some course and speed corrections to our strategy. But I certainly at this point in public won't talk much more specifically, because I think I owe it to the new administration to have that conversation in private first and then afford our decision makers a chance to make a decision.
Yes, ma'am.
Eva Blaisdell, founder of California Space Center, to be potentially built on Ronald Reagan land, but also honorary chairwoman of the Polish Air Force Academy. I am also representing Polish media here. Thank you for your compelling, strong speech on behalf of Polish people, where you are, as I'm sure you know, deploying a lot of American forces, battalions, F-16s, and Poland is a primary ally facing toward Russia. May I ask you, General, what message can I carry to Polish people and to my Polish Air Force Academy, which my father led in the past, between unity and support for brave Poles?
Sure. I think the first message, and I'd reiterate one that I made in my remarks, number one, I think the Polish people know that the United States of America has the capability to meet our NATO alliance commitment. That's point one. Number two, there's a physical manifestation of our commitment that's there today in the form of presence, and we're increasing that presence in what's known as the European Reassurance Initiative. And last year we began that initiative, and there's a significant increase in the European Reassurance Initiative in the coming year. And as you know, part of that is a physical presence in Poland itself. Each of the Baltic states, as well as Poland, will have an increase in forces on the ground. And I think you can also tell the Polish people that as a result of what we have done together over the past 15 years in particular, but really since the mid-1990s, I think we have the interoperability that's going to allow us to integrate capability. And when I look at the threat that NATO faces, if we are able to fully leverage 28 nations, the economic, the political, and the military capability of the 28 nations of NATO, I think the Polish people should sleep soundly at night. I think in the back, Governor.
Yes, lady in the back.
Hello, General Dunford, Andrea Shalal with Reuters. Good to see you. I live in Europe now, and I'm working over there, and I'm hearing a lot of concerns among the Europeans about the statements that have been made by President-elect Trump about NATO and not necessarily defending a partner if they haven't paid their full share. There's been some effort to mitigate those messages, but can you, from your perspective, kind of offer an idea of what needs to happen as far as the U.S. commitment to NATO? And then I also wanted to ask about the comments made by the Norwegian defense minister about Russia and potentially cutting off the resupply routes through the north, and just seeing that activity up there. What do you need to be able to counter that threat, and how do you do that effectively?
Sure. I mean, on the first part of the question, I'm clearly not going to get into policies of the next administration, although I have heard the President-elect very clearly express continued commitment to our NATO alliance. And so from a military planning perspective, you know, I'm assuming that the commitment that we have had to NATO since World War II is going to continue into the future. And frankly, again, the capabilities that we have deployed to Europe and the capability development path that I suggested we have to be on all supports our ability to meet our NATO commitment well into the future. And what we're dealing with in Russia, as I mentioned, is not only that day-to-day adversarial competition, but significant improvements in their capabilities. I suggested some of the areas, and I think you'll see when the chiefs come in collectively and we make our recommendations for the budget, much of the capability that we would prioritize would be relevant to dealing with the challenges that we face in NATO.
Last question. It appears the last question has been asked. General, we thank you for a very succinct and clear presentation. And I must say, sir, you generate high confidence. Thank you.
Thanks, Governor. Thank you.